आया हुआ था?
हाँ, टिमरमैन आया हुआ है, हाँ।
मैंने मना कर दिया. I didn't want to meet him. I didn't see the point.
कल वो
जाके
मिलेगा मंत्रियों से और सबसे.
हाँ
हम लोग
मिलेगा.
गए थे अभी टीटीसी करने वहां पे ब्रसल्स. तो
अच्छा.
सीबैम को लेके काफी हल्ला किया हम लोगों ने.
हाँ गुड.
तो they are saying कि नहीं वो we will talk and it may not, we'll find a way out of this. Let's see.
देखो क्या होता है. They're in a mess right now.
They are in a mess. So somebody said hi. Was it Pranay? So let me introduce you to Swapan. I don't know if you know him from before.
No, I don't know Swapan.
Swapan has been emailing you. Now
Okay.
he will question you.
Yes. So Swapan, you're also an alumni?
I am, Sunita. I'm also an alumni, 2006 batch.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've been working in forestry since I graduated. I run my own organization, IORA Ecological Solutions, which works on land restoration, forest conservation, and allied areas from a policy and implementation lens, based out of Delhi.
Oh, wonderful, Swapan. Very nice.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I want to talk about. Foresters should go back to forests.
Yeah. They should in fact go deep inside and make way for everybody else, right?
Exactly. So Sandeep, I decided no presentation. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
So I thought what I'll do is to start off and talk about the whole issue of the challenge of forestry in a climate risk world, the opportunities, and then I hope there'll be some question and answers, more a conversation. So that would be the best.
So, if I may, the format, I'll briefly introduce you, and then we'll have Sandeep, who chairs our alumni association, talk a little bit and welcome you on the association's behalf and his perspective, and then Advait, who's also our alumni. He's a faculty at IIFM. He'll briefly just talk about IIFM's current programs and what's going on there, and then we'll hand over to you for between 20 to 30 minutes, as much as you'd like to speak, and then we'll have question and answers. In the interim, if people post questions on chat, I'll keep a track of them and I'll post them to you at the end of the talk, or otherwise we'll just open it up and people can raise hands and ask you.
No problem.
Is that okay?
Perfect. Absolutely. Perfect.
So Sunita, we'll just give it 2-3 minutes more because few people are joining here. We also have this on YouTube Live, so a lot of our students are joining there. But we'll start sharp at 7:05. So just 1 more minute.
No problem. Whereas I'm in your hands.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Sunita ji. This is Pranay.
Hi, Pranay.
Hi. Anything that we're doing for the 30th anniversary, ma'am?
I'm so blasé about it. issue निकला अगले वाले पर काम करो भाई. आगे बढ़ो.
अरे नहीं. Pioneering.
Pranay and Sandeep sir, were you associated with CSC sometime or in the early days?
I was. In fact, I used to work for SIDA, and CSC used to be one of the SIDA projects, just like IIFM. So I remember I also did a review of CSC and all that. Those are long days
time
back.
ago. Yeah.
Long time ago, yeah.
I worked from 99 to 2004 with Sunita ji. Looking at health and environment. I had great fun.
Oh, fantastic. Great. I think we'll get started. And then people will, I think, keep joining, but we have a sizable number. So Sunita, on behalf of the IIFM Alumni Association, very, very delighted, and it's an honor to welcome you to the Friends of IIFM series. You are our fourth speaker, as I'd mentioned in my email, and then obviously exemplary one at that. And we are really delighted that our students and alumni are going to get a chance to hear from you and speak to you firsthand. So very quickly, although I know you don't need an introduction, but still, Sunita has been with CSC since 1982. She's a writer, environmentalist who uses knowledge for change. In fact, in 2005, she was awarded with one of the highest civil orders in India, the Padma Shri by the Indian government. She has also received the World Water Prize for work on rainwater harvesting and its policy influence in building paradigms for community-based water management. In 2005, she also chaired the Tiger Task Force at the direction of the PM to evolve an action plan for conservation. She advocated solutions to build coexistence agenda with communities. She was a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, as well as the National Ganga River Basin Authority. A major authority on anything related to environment, forests, gets called upon by the government to act in several capacities, and for many of us is a major force who supports the idea of nature and its coexistence with development in this country. So Sunita, very, very warm welcome. Really looking forward to the next hour. Really glad that you could spare this time. With this, I'm going to hand over to Sandeep, who's the president of the Alumni Association, to also say a few words to talk about the association and to welcome you here formally. Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you, Sapan, and thank you, Sunita ji, for agreeing to join our series. Let me just tell you a little bit about the institute. You know about the institute; it has had its trajectory ups and downs, but I think we have now got the institute when it's on an up and it's going up. One reason for that is that our alumni has started getting more involved in the affairs of the institute. And so much so that we decided to make one of us the director of the institute. Unfortunately, he is not here. He is in some G20 event in Mumbai. But his representative Advait, who is also an alumni, will be speaking to us. So what we have done over the last year or 2 years or so is that first we didn't have a proper alumni association, so we made one, and but we were stuck by COVID, so things didn't move. And then we had elections, and I was asked to lead the association, and we have been doing several activities, mobilizing the alumni, which are in diverse fields. Many are in the conservation, forestry, development sector. Others are in forest industries. Many in non-profit organizations. Some in funding agencies. Others in consultancy. Now all these big four have got into the environment space. Many are in climate, carbon market. So it's a diverse set of people, but somehow or the other related to the broad agenda of climate, environment, forestry. So I think we are one of the very few maybe institutions globally which producing managers and workforce or professionals for this sector. So that's a positive. But since the institute has had issues of leadership, it didn't meet its potential. But now I think we are back on track, and we will do that. To bring the alumni together and to give it a purpose and an agenda, we have started with these Friends of IIFM lectures. It's a monthly lecture started in January of this year. We have had people like Arif Solim and Professor Vijay Raghavan and several others who have addressed us on a monthly basis. So students, alumni, everybody, it's an open lecture who join, and basically trying to keep the issues in focus. So this is what I wanted to tell you about the Alumni Association, and I hope that CSC is such an pioneering institution and organization in the environment space. I hope you will recruit from the institute, offer us training programs, internships, because maybe somehow earlier we were involved in a bigger way, but now I think that has got a bit in disarray, but we could do that. But I must assure you that the alumni and the institute is now back in focus, and we are trying to get ourselves known in the sector, because I think it's a unique institution. And I just, before I hand over to Advait, I just want to recognize one of our colleagues who was from the first batch, Manoj Dabas, and it's the first time that we have been able to get somebody from the first batch join our alumni association event. So Manoj, welcome to you as well, and you all look up to him. He's also very active in this sphere. And with these words, I hand over to Advait. Is it?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Definitely, Sunita, looking forward to more collaborations between IIFM and CSC in addition to recruitments. But Advait will shed more light on what IIFM is doing and about a little bit about our modified programs, etc. And then we'll start with the talk. Advait, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sapan. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. Welcome, ma'am. We're really delighted to have you here as part of our Friends of IIFM series. On behalf of our director, Dr. K. Ravichandran, who is unfortunately traveling at the moment. I welcome you. Um, a little bit about IIFM. We have a wonderful campus, about 230 acres. And for the last 35 years, we've had a program called the Postgraduate Diploma in Forestry Management. It's the 35th batch that will be coming in. And for the last 4 years, we've had another program called the Postgraduate Diploma in Sustainability Management. So both of these programs are equivalent to master's degrees. And we've had a wonderful array of alumni, some of them are here today, uh, working in the fields of environment and, as Sandeepda said, right from ecotourism, wildlife, forestry, microfinance, the gamut of, so everything in which there is some amount of natural resource management and some amount of management as such. So they've we call ourselves green managers. So in addition to that, we've had certificate courses of various kinds in forestry. We have a PhD program on. We also have we had an MPhil program for the last several years, and so we are primarily an educational institute, but we also do research. We've been doing research on forest certification. We've been doing research on ecosystem services valuation. There's some human wildlife conflict research that we're doing. Lots of work, related to livelihood. Several such areas in the interface of the environment and sociology, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So for the last several years, we've been trying to get into the sustainability space, which is and climate change. And so I think the talk that you're going to about to give to our students and alumni is moot. It's really important, climate change. So without further ado, I'd hand it over back to you, and I think we should start.
Thank you, Advait. Sunita, over to you. Eagerly looking forward to hear from you, and then we'll jump back for question answers.
Thank you, Advait. Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you, Swapan. I'm also delighted to be here with you and delighted to have this opportunity. When I thought about what I should really talk about to all of you, I decided to do a little bit of history and to discuss a little bit about the role of forests in the past and the role of forests that should be there, in my view, both today and in the future. And that's really where the whole issue of forestry in terms of development, forestry in terms of people and livelihoods, and forestry today, most importantly, in the age of climate change, needs to be looked at and addressed. So let's go back a little bit. And when I go back, I think all of you will realize just how old I am. But if I was to tell you that when I started my career in the 1980s, forestry was the top agenda when it came to environmental management. In fact, forestry was the only agenda that we spoke about. Wildlife to some extent, but really it was about forests. This was the time when we had the NRSA coming up with the first time the map of India showing the extent of degradation, comparing it to previous and then to the 80s, and essentially giving a shock therapy to say that there was very high levels of degradation. Forestry was center stage in terms of what needs to be done. This was also the time when Rajiv Gandhi, as the Prime Minister, set up the National Afforestation Board. Why? Because the whole question about how do we plant trees, where do we plant trees, and what are the trees for? It was the top environmental agenda. There was also, of course, the agenda about stopping deforestation. And that's where the whole question about the Forest Conservation Act came in, which many of us are responsible for and today regret it because of the culture of forestry as only no-go has become, and that is what I want to talk about. But stick to history. So in the 1980s, forestry was the top agenda. It was about how do we stop deforestation, how do we protect our forests, and how do we grow more forests. And when the question about growing more forest came in, it was about livelihoods, it was about people, it was about communities, it was about, by the early 90s, it became the joint forest management. It really was center stage. Today, when I think about forestry, it has gone off the agenda. It is not on the radar anymore. It may be there amongst people like us who very strongly believe in these issues, but quite frankly, the only time forestry gets discussed is when the Forest Conservation Act is being discussed, and the question about clearances and what should be cleared and what shouldn't be cleared. What we have done, therefore, with forestry has been that it has completely disappeared in terms of the development agenda of this country. What this means is that the pendulum has swung. In the early 80s, it was all about extraction. It was all about how much forests were being cut for paper mills, how we had no, how we needed to protect our forests. Since then, we have moved the pendulum for forestry to become the conservation agenda. Now, in all that, if you look at it today, forestry as a development agenda has been lost. We don't talk about the fact that India today imports vast quantities of its timber needs from other countries of the world. We don't talk about the fact that large areas of this country, the forests are underutilized. We don't talk about development forestry. We don't talk about this because the minute we talk about it, or the minute I talk about it, I get this absolute umbrage of saying to me, but madam, this will destroy our forests, because the only way we can protect our forests is to make sure that we have very high levels of protection, conservation, and that we should not talk about cutting trees, we should not talk about growing trees and cutting them, because if we do so, we will not be able to control the management inside our forests. So it's a conservation agenda. Yes, there are working plans, but if you look at the overall picture, if you look at the accounts of states, as we have done in Down to Earth, and I hope some of you have seen those stories that which we have looked at, is what is the state account and what does it show in terms of forestry? Even earlier, forest accounts were never separated. They were always part of the agriculture, fisheries, and forests. Now, if you ask for any disaggregated figure on forests, it doesn't exist. When I tried to do even further research to say, so what is the role of forestry in a state national account? It's so negligible that it isn't even worth talking about. Now, we can all sit back and say that's wonderful, because we can see now, if you take the State of Forest report, government says, though I have challenged that, if any one of you have seen the cover story that we did, the investigation we did, but overall, the numbers show that forest cover is stable. Nobody is talking about increase, we're talking about stable forest cover. However, if you start comparing what is the recorded forest area with the forest cover, you find a huge mismatch of forest area which has virtually disappeared off the books. Now, this is probably land which never existed, land which is never under the forest department. The fact is, this lack of clarity tells us that people really don't even care to put forest accounts even after digitization, to say this is really the forest accounts of this country. Now, this becomes even more crucial today when we are looking at the issue of development, and then if you're looking at the issue of climate change. So first, let me take development. The fact is, you have, by all records, and I would dispute them, but as I have in writing, but by all records, some 23%, 22% of India's land area is under forest today. This is very important land area. We're a land poor. We have huge density of population. We have large numbers of people who live in the habitats of our forests. If you map where the poor of this country live, where the insurgency is, where destitution is, where marginalized people live, it is in the forested areas of the country. This is the resource curse that we should be talking about. But forests are not part of the development of the people over there. We had an incomplete experiment in trying to do joint forest management, but as many of you know, what that actually resulted in was a fraud on the local communities, because at the end of the day, what they got was checks of 10 rupees, 15 rupees when the forests were out for harvesting. We today have a talk about community forest management, very welcome, but there is no movement to say this is what needs to be supported. Because the issue is, we don't really look at forests as part of what do we want to do with them. We only today have made forests as areas where development projects are so-called told not to go. And yet all of us know, and if you look at the Forest Conservation Act data, please take a look at the cover story that Down to Earth did a few years ago, looking at the FCA and looking at coal mining projects, also looking at the procedure in terms of how forest clearances are given. It's a broken system. We know that forests are being cleared every time a development project comes in, because there is virtually no real scrutiny. Some ad hoc committees meet inside rooms. They have some ways of measuring good, bad, should we not. Yet when you look at the decisions, it is very clear that everything is down to some decision that needs to be made in the so-called interests of the country. Now, there is no doubt that development is needed. There is no doubt that we need to look at where forests will need to be protected and where forests maybe do not need to be protected. There needs to be a balance. Today, we have created such a situation in our cities that people refuse to plant trees on roadsides because they say they will not get permission to cut them. We have made literally planting trees into a crime. It's a deterrence. That is not the way you build a forest future. And for me, forestry is part of development. We need to grow the trees so that we can cut the trees, so that we can regrow the trees. Now, the challenge in India has always been that we have a very high population density. We have a very high livestock population density. And we know, as any one of us and all of us actually have traveled and seen, that there is virtually no fence that can keep out the animals of the poor. Now, this is where the collaborative, cooperative model of forestry was thought of. We have not made it work. And today we have reached a situation where we cannot grow trees that survive. And so we basically don't do forestry to grow and to cut so that we can regrow them again. I keep thinking about this, and Sandeep, you will be amazed to know that when Anil and I started working on climate change, which was in 1991, our climate change work actually began after we had looked at the issue of forestry in India, and we called the global commons atmosphere the goat factor. We said that, just like in a commons in the forest, you cannot keep the goat out unless there is a collaborative model and that people will benefit from the usufruct rights or the timber that grows on the forest. You will not be able to build a forest future. It's the same thing when it came to the atmosphere. A global atmosphere is a commons which needs the principle of climate justice and equity, just like we need in forestry. Now, that's really where the real challenge is, our ability to be able to grow the trees, our ability to be able to cut the trees, and our ability to be able to regrow the trees. Now, I am always being told that, madam, don't talk about forest land. Let's talk about growing trees outside forest land. We have a goal of 33%, and that is what we are going to do outside. Now, if you take a look at the Forest Survey of India, that's actually already happening. People are growing trees not because of the government, but in spite of the government. The fact is, the kind of unliberalized economy we have on growing trees, it really is one in which you would wonder, why do people even bother to grow a tree? Many years ago, and Mr. Jairam Ramesh owed me some favors because of the pressures we were putting on him for something else. And I basically went to him and said that, you know, the biggest thing that you could do as the environment minister is to make take bamboo out of the Indian Forest Act. Classify it as a grass and not a tree. Jairam was open to it, a lot of resistance. Finally, it was done, but transit passes were not given because you still had to get permission and transit passes. Some loophole we managed to find to say, let's give it to groups which have community forests. But the fact is that even now, we have so many restrictions on growing, cutting, transporting, using trees that it basically has made this into a no-go business. I keep hearing of some very brave individuals who are wanting to do community forests, work with people to grow their trees. I keep hearing about states now liberalizing the species of trees that can be grown, can be transported. But there is still too much work that needs to be done so that you change the whole image of forestry from an image that says, this is conservation, to this is really about development. Now, I know when I'm saying this, and I can see a lot of questions popping up, and I'm not sure what you're asking, but I know this is the first thing that I get challenged, that, you know, but if you do this, you're basically opening the doors for deforestation. No, I'm not. I think we need to be very clear where forests need to be protected. And those are the ecologically most important lands of this country, which in some senses are your wildlife reserves, your sanctuaries. As many of you know and may know, I was chairing the Tiger Task Force for the last government. And I had put the issue of tigers within the question about the landscape of forests and within the question about coexistence with local communities, something on which there has been a lot of resistance. And even now, when I look back, because when I do a report for the government, and that's why probably government doesn't ask me for them anymore, I make sure that the recommendations are followed through. And on the tigers, I did get a lot. I got the whole issue of the scientific methodology of estimating tigers changed. We got that done. We got the Tiger Authority created. We got a huge budgetary allocation. We improved the protection, got a Wildlife Crime Bureau done. Even got the issue of relocation improved for local communities so that they would have rights over the land that they were given as relocation. But we didn't get the biggest agenda going, which is the issue of coexistence, which is really about how you would share the benefits of conservation with local communities, whether it is about how they would participate in the tourism revenue or in the protection revenue or in other ways. You've essentially disabled their livelihoods because we as middle class want to protect our wildlife. And this really is the challenge we have today. And that's really what I want to end with in my last 5 minutes, is the issue of forestry when it comes to climate change. Today, it is very clear that the clock is ticking as far as climate change is concerned. The IPCC has very clearly said we have a very small window to act, and that small window is closing by the minute. We know that by 2030, the world would have run out of the carbon budget to keep us below 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. And we know this is at a time when 70% of the world does not have access to development. And we also know that countries like India are highly vulnerable. We have extreme weather events happening across the country. CSE, in its last report, we did an analysis of the IMD data to look at the extent of extreme weather events as classified by IMD. And we found that there was one event a day between the 1st of January to the 30th of September. Now, this means the poor of this country are the victims of climate change. They are the worst impacted by climate change. So this is the reality of climate change. Yet we also know that there is only one way that the world, I mean, there are some other ways, but the one really strong way which you talk about net zero is that we need to sequester more and more carbon dioxide. And the one huge opportunity we have, other than the ocean, is the forest, the land sink that we have. Now, this is where forestry plays a huge role in today and tomorrow's India, both in terms of development, but also in terms of climate resilience and in terms of sequestering carbon dioxide. But all that means that we need to change the very nature of forestry so that we can actually make that part of the way communities can grow trees, they can benefit, and they can in turn regrow the trees because they have an incentive to protect it and to regrow it. This is not about just doing plantations, but it is also about doing plantations. It is about making sure that a certain part of the forest are protected. They're completely no-go areas. Those parts of the forest need to be paid for in terms of the ecological cost for protecting the forest, for safeguarding the forest, both as watersheds, as biodiversity reservoirs, as forest reservoirs, forest repositories. That needs to be protected and paid for. Yet, if you see, India has had a system in which the forests, the states with large forest areas would be paid for. We did it as part of the Finance Commission, but we've taken that away because we were never serious about it. We never looked at it as an ecological price that has to be paid to the community for the protection of the land which they live adjoining to, because they are the ones who are giving up their livelihoods for protecting that forest. But then the other part of the forest needs to be part of the development future. Now, this is where, and I hope that you as forest management experts will start looking at the timber markets of this country. The question that I keep getting asked is, so how does private forestry work when there is such distortions in the market when it comes to public forestry, when it comes to timber, that even little bits of it which is coming from forest land? How does it work when there is so much restriction on the growing, cutting, transporting and selling of it? When there is such a stigma on building with wood? Today, the entire world is talking about the most sustainable buildings are those made by wood. But talk about it to an Indian environmentalist, conservationist, they say, how can you build with wood? That's unsustainable. So we build with steel, we build with cement. We said that's more sustainable, or is wood more sustainable? And I think we need this conversation in India, because unless we talk about it, we're not going to be able to find the answers out of it. And I know, I mean, we have agreed to take young probationers coming out of young forest probationers to come to CSE, and we often do training as well. And I find there's such a pushback when I talk about this. I mean, I've reached the point of extreme frustration. I find that on every other issue, we are able to have a discussion. But when it comes to forestry, is dogma. Dogma that we have created, dogma that we are all responsible for, but dogma which needs to go. Because today, forests have a key role in both the development of this country where the poorest live, they need the livelihood support. Otherwise, remember, every time the forest issue comes up, somebody is going to compare the amount of livelihood that we get from coal mining, we get from aluminium, bauxite mining, we get from iron ore mining versus keeping aside the forests. So we need forests to be part of this future. And we also need to make sure that we can do forest management. We can grow forests because that's what we need for sequestering, for climate resilience in the years to come. It is also very, very clear that unless we build resilience, and resilience will come from nature, into the hands of local communities, they will be even bigger victims of climate change impacts in the years to come. So this really then becomes the bigger role for forestry, for bigger role for trees, the tree wealth in terms of food, in terms of fiber, in terms of building materials, in terms of making sure that our land is green, regenerated, restored, but it is in the hands of people who benefit from it. And this is really the biggest challenge that we have. So I think I've spoken enough, and I will look forward to a lot of questions. I'm sure you have them, so we can have and then we can then discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita, and thank you very much for that perspective on how we've traditionally been managing this really productive ecosystem from a lens of control and have been truly compromising on the true ability of our forests to contribute significantly to our economic, ecological overall growth. And it's high time that we unlock that potential by moving beyond and by recognizing potential market linkages that can derive from forests. So we have a lot of comments and observations from your talk in the chat, but which we can go through. But in the interim, I'll also request everybody or anybody who has a question to please raise their hands, and then I'll invite you to address a question directly to Sunita while I peruse the chat and see if there is any question there. Anybody would like to kick off? Sorry, just a second. Varun, why don't I invite you to share? You've shared some very interesting observations on how a lot of multi-use elements of forestry are neglected, and some thoughts on how they can be mainstream. So why don't you share your thoughts, and if there's also a question in there for Sunita. So may I invite Varun to please unmute and speak? Varun, are you there?
If Varun is delayed, can I jump in?
Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Fantastic perspective you are giving, and I think that is the crux of the challenge that India faces. That if we just go by the conservation and strict control approach, then we may be able to conserve it, but slowly even that will disappear. So it has to be a dynamic, market linked economic model, at least part of it, like some of these Scandinavian countries do. They do forest cultivation in a big way to meet the needs of people, industry, and then you keep away our sanctuaries and our wildlife reserves and protect those old growth forests and grow trees in the peripheries. But you're right, there is a problem in because how to distinguish what is coming from the forest or what is coming from non-forest land. And what is disturbing is what you mentioned later on, that even the debate on this is not happening, I think. But to just turn it around a bit, with climate and carbon sequestration being the latest buzzword, don't you think that maybe just keeping the forest the way it is and not focus on that, but try to the point that you also made, that to grow trees on non-forest land and have a dynamic and a policy framework for that? What is happening on that? Because a lot of people are, out of love of trees or whatever reason, because maybe agriculture is becoming non-remunerative in many ways, people have started growing trees. So are we moving towards a policy framework, or what is happening in that? That is what I wanted to know.
So, Sandeep, very good question. I think there is a lot more interest in forest, what they call trees outside forests. And there is a lot more interest in growing it. This government has also set up, has basically made sure that all governments are putting out clear indicators to state governments to deregulate or to take the trees outside, tree species outside the restricted list. So it is beginning to happen. But, there is really nobody putting their time to build a viable market. Look at what happened with poplar. A few years ago, the poplar whole industry collapsed. There was no support given, there's nobody out there helping the farmers when it comes to a collapse of an industry like this. And the collapse happened largely because there was a glut of wood at that time. The matchmaking industry basically put pressure. They were not willing to buy the wood from the farmers. They didn't have any other source of selling it. And people literally, when our reporters went from down to earth, we found people were plucking out the trees and just throwing them. They had just no interest. Now that creates a general sense that, and remember, trees are not like a food crop, I know. Even when I've seen eucalyptus plantations growing for paper industry, it's a 4-year, 5-year cycle with tissue growth, 7 years. And, farmers can only take crops for 1 or 2 years. After that, you're basically leaving the land vacant. You're putting in labor. It's an opportunity cost loss. So somebody has to support all that. And there has to be a viable market. We are seeing now more and more happen with paper industry because there is an interest, but there is so much import and cheap import coming in of paper and pulp from other parts of the world. Why would you invest the time and labor into your own farmers? See, the main thing is, Sandeep, nobody in this country is really talking about forestry. And I'm challenging all of you. As I'm saying, in the 80s, forestry was the top agenda. Today, when do you hear the forest word? You hear it in some small circuits. It doesn't even make it to the main pages of a newspaper anymore. Okay? In fact, the only time I read about forestry is when one tree is being cut and some resident welfare association, some middle class Indian is sort of up in arms, I won't let that tree be cut. That's not forestry. I was given a task by the High Court of Delhi to look at some trees on this, the Vasant Kunj Road. And residents of Vasant Kunj were protesting that they didn't want the trees cut because the roads had to be widened. Firstly, they had encroached on the roads. They had no business to do so. The trees had grown willy-nilly. The forest department was now counting the number of trees, species, the girth of the trees. The PWD was extending the road. Everybody was in the business of making sure that you were caught in a crisis where those trees became the centerpiece. Now, when I wrote to the High Court, I said, do what you want. For me, you could cut those trees and regrow them. But what I pointed to the High Court is, sir, just behind this, there is the south ridge of Delhi, which is getting encroached upon by the minute. That's where our focus should be. But we have really reached a point of, I think, the forest community, and that's why I decided to be a little more provocative with all of you, treat you as friends, because I really don't even speak about this anymore. Because I find the reaction is just so adverse that my attitude is, do what you want. You're in a hole. Nobody will ask you in the next 5 years that if you're a forester or not a forester. There's not even going to be one penny given to you. So I am only telling you that as an environmentalist, we are responsible for the conservation agenda for this country, but now we need conservation to become the development agenda as well. And we need forestry to become part of the mainstream. You do it of trees outside forest land, you do it within forest land, I don't care. But you need to talk about forestry as part of development.
Thank you, Sunita. I actually have a question on TOF versus forestry in the chat, but before that, let me invite Vanita, who's raised her hand, to ask you a question. Vanita?
Thanks, Sunita. I've always admired you. So very good to see you here. So my question is, even before we talk about, I first of all, you have raised very, very interesting thing about it, because I remember, being part of that journey from 90s onwards. And my issue is that on agenda setting. So in terms of agenda setting, while Ford Foundation was there, and Terry and SPWD and CSC and many Vixat and many organizations who were talking about this whole issue, and a lot of conversation was about to, in a way, say no to the productive forestry, or and to say on joint forest management, or the right of the people, first charge of the forest dependent people and all that. And then lately we saw that the whole scholarship, whole research on the forestry just stopped, right? So no one is now working on, and you rightly said. So my whole question is that, in this kind of setup, and the whole change has taken place, where the foresters are not even willing to listen about, as you said, that kind of development agenda, but conservation only. So my question is bigger than that, that how in the sector, how do you put the agenda, and in terms of responsibility of the civil society, as you said, it's a responsibility is ours, in terms of taking this whole journey towards so much about conservation, that we probably are missing that, the potential, the large potential which forests have. And of course there were issues also in terms of the loss making units of forest development corporations who were set up only for this purpose, and everything. um, yeah, but my question is about this whole agenda setting, and how do we take ownership, and how do we still create those spaces? Of course down to earth does that that kind of that the knowledge management, and which comes beyond the agenda setting by many donors, I would say. Thanks.
Thanks, Vinita. Very good question. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we're all part of the agenda that was set in the past. I can speak for myself. I think at no point we were definitely wanting conservation, but at all time we were interested in development. In fact, I'll give you a very interesting example, Vanita, and this is really going back into history. I remember at one time the committee had been set up for timber substitution, and I'm talking about late 80s. And Anil actually at that time wrote a very strong article and a strong comment to the government saying, why should we, if you substitute timber, you will substitute it with, aluminum and steel. And we should not look at it from that point of view. We should really look at forestry from, we should be able to grow, cut and regrow the forest. If we look at JFM at that time, JFM was not an idea to not grow trees. It was an idea to say, how can we grow trees? Because of exactly what I've explained to you, which is my perspective, may not be the right perspective, but definitely my perspective from when I was traveling with Anil across the length and breadth of India, looking at forestry. It was very clear that you could only grow productive, fodder-based, multi-purpose trees if you had the cooperation of local communities, because otherwise you really could not do good. Your tree survival rate would be very poor. Now, this is why JFM came into the picture, which was all about how do you grow the tree? How do you work with local communities? Well, you work with them if they get usufruct rights over the protected area, and in return, they do the protection. And then an agreement is signed that when the trees grow, they will get the timber, they will get benefits from the timber. The records are that by the time the trees grew, everybody had lost interest, and the forest department gave some 10 rupees, 15 rupees, 50 rupees to people and told them that, you know, rest of the money had just gone into the salaries of the department. And that was the net that was left. You destroyed an experiment. Now you're absolutely right. The agenda has to be reset. Agendas must be set and reset in any country. Why are we so rigid and dogmatic that, after all, all of us contributed to the setting of an agenda? But today there is such a, I mean, I just find, I'll be very clear, Vanita, I have given up. I have too much other to do where I can make an impact, I can get things done. And, you know, you choose your battles. And I remember when I was chairing the forest, the Tiger Task Force, I put out a forest agenda. But there was huge resistance even then. And then I was asked even more recently by the government to be on a committee that looked at trees outside forest and what were the barriers and what to do. And I again put out an agenda. And there's basically a huge resistance. I mean, so my attitude is, you know, many battles to fight, many issues to do. But I'm happy to be with all of you. I hope if there's some combined strength, we may be able to reset the agenda. But for the moment, I think forestry as an agenda is gone. And today, with climate change and the entire sequestration agenda has become a sequestration agenda, which is a scam after scam after scam. If you look at who is doing the sequestration, who is promising that they're growing the trees, you will be appalled. And I know every time somebody investigates a tree, a timber for sinks issue, it turns out that the trees were never planted. So I think we are really in a situation where we need to bring forestry back. We need to bring it into center stage. And I hope that all of you, as the alumni of an institution which actually was set up at the same time as, I mean, it was an institution way ahead of its time, because what it was really doing was to say forestry was also about management. And it was not just about growing trees, but all the other elements of it. And I think it was an amazing effort to set up a forest management institute. But we've lost the idea of forestry. So we've lost the idea of what we do with the management of forest. And I think that's where IIFM and you as the alumni can play a big role in bringing this back. So thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Sunita. I think clearly this idea of holistic thinking on forest as a national resource with multiple functions and bringing that back on the development agenda as well as the ecological is something that no community is better placed to do than us. And I think that that's something that we must continue conversation on for sure. We have, I think Mr. Manoj Dabas had his hand raised. Sir, do you want to ask a question?
Varun also has a question.
I think while he figures out, I think, some technical glitch.
Varun has a question.
Varun's question is about the FTCs, right?
Yes.
That's what he's typed out. So I can answer that. So
Yeah,
I think the FTCs were created at a time when the extraction agenda was at the top. FTCs have lost the plot because we have never been able to tell them what is their new role, because we don't know the role of forestry. So I think it is not their fault. I think it is the fault of the national narrative, national agenda, where we really don't know what is the agenda for forests. The only agenda that I can see is the Forest Conservation Act and what should not be cleared. The second agenda that comes up is how tigers need to be protected, not even any other species. Maybe a few cheetahs now, but beyond that, tiger and FC Act. What is the third agenda of forestry? When do you read about forestry? When do you read about the fact that how much timber are we importing from Malaysia? How much timber are we importing from all other countries? So I think the FTCs need a clear agenda, which we can only give them when we are clear about the role that forests need to play.
Yeah, absolutely. Just checking if Mr. Manoj Dabas is able to unmute and speak. Sir, can you
hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, Sunita. My name is Manoj Dabas. I have had a chance to meet you. I used to head office in Delhi. I used to work for Wimco. You talked of Popular just a short while ago. I was there.
Swapan, I can't hear him.
Okay. Okay. I think that, sir, if you can just type your question if possible, there might be some technical issue.
He's very faint, actually.
Okay. Just a second. Let me just go to him. We are actually close by, and he can speak from my computer. Just a second. 1 second. Okay, here.
Yeah.
Third time. Hi, Sunita. My name is Manoj Dabas.
Yes,
I used to head your office in New Delhi. I have met you, but I don't expect you to, remember vividly. You took many names. You took off Wimco and the Popular Experiment. I started my career in forestry with a job in Wimco. So it was saddening when that Popular program died. And there were systemic reasons. It died because of match industry. Match industry, like Wimco, was not given a license to expand operations, which would have allowed it to, consume all the wood that North India was growing. Matchmaking was reserved for the small scale industries, and Wimco slowly died a very slow death for the simple government's policy that big industry cannot be making matches, good or bad, be as it may. I currently head a program which is called, not head in a leadership position of the program. It's called Trees Outside Forests in India. It's a program supported by USAID and anchored by Ministry of Environment and Forests, with 7 states part of it. This is not a commercial for this program, but all the things that you said should happen are actually on the agenda of this program. But one thing that was not touched during this discourse was that when wheat prices fall down or go up, everybody wakes up. When onion prices go up and come down, everybody wakes up. But when wood prices go up and come down, nobody wakes up. Today, the amount of wood we are importing from outside is phenomenal, and a country of India's size with more 140 crore people cannot afford, and even the world cannot afford, that India outsources its wood production to countries like Gabon and Malaysia, etc. They're just way too small to meet the growing needs of a country like India, which is still at the very bottom of the heap in terms of per capita consumption of wood-based products. That is number one. So what are your views on this wood being on open general license, while everything else is on such a sensitive list that onion prices in Lasalgaon go up by 50 rupees a quintal, and then alarm bells start ringing in Delhi. So not only the transit part, but this open general license which has been given to import wood, that anybody can just ship wood into India, and that is also playing an equal role in killing Indian farmer, because the wood prices are suppressed because of unrestricted imports. So I wanted to bring this issue to the attention, and also wanted your comments on that. Thank you.
No, Manoj, you've touched on everything. That's exactly what I also said. This government, the Trees Outside Forest is a very interesting program, but it cannot work in an environment where you have not created the right conditions for trees to grow outside forests. And the OGL is completely wrong when it comes to protecting. It's all done again with that same narrative. We have to protect our forests so we can go and get forests from everywhere else. But the fact is, what does that do to, look at the data from Kerala. Kerala is basically today all the forests in Kerala are not being used, but we are getting all the wood from outside. I think it just has to change. But it can't change because I can't see, even though there is now more interest in getting, I have seen the list changing. I did do a very strong note to the government when I was made part of the committee to look at trees outside forests, that these are the various things. And I raised the issue of OGL as well. We've written about it in Down to Earth as well. We've also written about the fact that we need to have conditions in which trees can be grown, cut and regrown by people, which mean transit passes. But then the pushback always is that how do we know where the trees has grown? You know, these trees can come from our forest. But I'm now told that there is now ways of doing some, you know, you can put a, I don't know, something into it, something which will track it. But I think it's a debate which has to change, because at the end of the day, why should the tree come from inside the forest? Because you are basically not being able to protect your forest, and you're not being able to protect your forest because you haven't built the conditions in which you can protect them with the people who will benefit from them. So I think you're absolutely right, Manoj. I have nothing to add other than to say I hope best of luck to the efforts that you're making. And I do hope you will succeed, because it is absolutely critical that we as a country, which is large, which will use a lot more wood than we are today, have to grow our own wood, have to utilize our own land, and have to benefit from it, and not just use the wood that is grown in other parts of the world.
I have the permission of the chair to ask one more add-on question, and that relates to the history of this debate on, you know, eucalyptus poplar versus monoculture versus, species diversity and agroforestry. When it's obviously agroforestry will always have, you know, more focus on fast-growing species, because that is what sells in the market and impacts the agricultural production least. But in the heyday of when eucalyptus was, we were beaten to death by on the issue of biodiversity. That when you plant eucalyptus, you know, you are hitting biodiversity. When you plant poplar, you are killing biodiversity. And I used to ask the question that where is eucalyptus planted? It's planted in a wheat field. And what is wheat? Wheat itself is a monoculture. So when you introduce something like eucalyptus or poplar in a wheat or a rice field, you're actually multiplying the biodiversity by 2. And but that question at that time was it was sin to say those things. I was working in the industry, and we used to augment this logic that when I'm introducing eucalyptus into a wheat field, I'm actually multiplying biodiversity by 2. I'm not reducing it. But do you think the mindset has now come a full circle, or when tomorrow India wakes up to its wood shortages again, and how much aluminum and steel can you produce to replace what? So do you think that mindset has changed, or we are still stuck in that biodiversity grew even for trees outside forests, you know, production systems?
I think it's, you know, we are all responsible for all this. I have no doubt I'm responsible as much as anyone else for creating for this thing about plantation forestry. But I can tell you that from CSC's point of view, we were the first to stand with the paper industry when they were growing eucalyptus outside in community with people. And we actually gave them higher marks for the wood that they were growing with people rather than wood that they were getting from forest land at throwaway prices. So I think it's important that but I don't think the debate has changed. I think whenever I talk about plantation, even now, it is seen as a no-go. You don't discuss plantations because they're bad. They're monoculture. But I keep saying, and I agree with you completely, plantations are grown where plantations should be grown. Forests need to be protected where forests need to be protected. Everything, and I would have hoped that we would have matured. As I tried to explain in my discussion, we went from extraction, but instead of the pendulum has now stuck to only conservation biodiversity. We somehow need to bring it back to a balance that says we need biodiversity, we need forests to be protected where there is high biodiversity, and that those forests should definitely be no-go. But there is a role of plantations which is also there, because forests need to be grown, cut and regrown. And you can only do that if you're doing cultivation of forests. And you cannot do cultivation of forests only by doing it with multiple species. You will have to do monoculture as well if you want high productive forestry. So there is nothing wrong with that. But I think we have not reached the point where we have been able to swing it to a level where we can discuss both. We either discuss only extraction or we still only discuss conservation. We still haven't been able to find the balance. Now, I hope we'll do so in the future. But as yet, I don't see, every time I do talk to the foresters and I talk to forestry probationers, I don't see that. I don't see that within the community, my larger community. I'm talking about my own community. We had a huge discussion at our last Anil Agarwal dialogue on the same question about the role of forestry. And I found there was such resistance from my own community to this whole discussion. So I think we have really divided ourselves between forests, tribal, tiger, trees. We do not look at forestry as an overall, and we don't have that understanding. But I hope we will in the future.
Thank you. I leave the floor for others.
I think that, thank you. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, Sunita. I think we are at time. There are a number of other comments relating to the challenge that when you grow, when you are focused on commercial forestry, then there is a challenge that you also need to sustain mature forests, which is true. You need to have a balance, and I think that we can have a lengthy conversation on that. There is a comment also that there is land holdings in other countries are much larger. In India, we have small land holdings, so it's difficult to have multi-utility plantations. You tend to do monocultures. I think that's a important facet.
Swapan, I'm sorry, I have no patience for all this. There are only problems that are being listed. I think I only want to tell you people, my challenge to you is grow up, think about your future. Forestry is not on the agenda. You want to be part of the agenda. Start looking for solutions. I'm too old in this to be given a set of problems. I've heard them all. Okay.
Sunita, I think that's a summary of your lecture as well. That point that we've dabbled in the similar range of problems for a very long time, and even though all of them are real, I think we're not denying those problems. Those are constraints around which we need to manage a system, and at the moment that system is failing in some ways. So we obviously need a change in thought, and there is no denying the fact that we are not able to utilize this ecosystem, and if you don't utilize it very well, it might just disappear very soon because it's of not too much contribution to the country. I think on that note, I think we can close for today, Sunita. Thank you very much for that last comment. I think it is very important for us to resoundingly carry that message with us and engage with you further on this. Before we conclude, I'd like to firstly, on behalf of the Alumni Association and IIFM, thank you profusely for your time and your thoughts. And I think summarizing in 20 minutes several decades of your experience, both frustrations as well as thoughts and issues that you've tried to champion. And I can assure you that many of us are thinking and working on those issues. And I really take your point that problems are problems. Let's move towards solutions. With that, Sunita, if you have any further final words to speak, I welcome you again. If not, we'll close now and we'll be in touch on several of these points. Thank you so much.
Just to say thank you, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Really happy.
Completely. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you,
Very
everyone.
thought-provoking.